Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Taylor, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. Welcome to our shareholder activism roundtable. Thanks everyone for being here. And I am going to go ahead and push out an audience poll right now. Just three simple questions here asking if you've been part of a campaign before, your role, just making sure that we can kind of speak to experience levels a little bit better here. And then we'll kind of run through our discussion and do some Q&A at the end. So go ahead and drop any of your questions into our Q&A tab, and we'll keep track of them for you.
Thank you, Taylor. Appreciate it. So just update us on the results of the poll when they come in. Let's give people like a few minutes to input their information. And meanwhile, maybe we can start with the quick intros. I'm Wahid Hassan, the founder and CEO of ZMH Advisors. We are excited to have an exceptional group of panelists to discuss director recruitment in activist campaigns. The importance of director recruitment has become even more pronounced in the era of universal proxy card, where investors can pick and choose individual nominees from management and activist slates. Let me introduce the panelists. Rory Wallace is the founder of Outerbridge Capital, a New York-based investment advisor that typically invests across the technology and technology-impacted sectors. Outerbridge entered into cooperation agreements with for board seats at Barnes & Noble Education and Comtech Telecom. Welcome, Rory.
Thanks, Wahid.
Thanks. Next, we have Patricia Lenkov. She's the CEO of Agility Executive Search, an executive and board recruiting firm that works with both companies and investors. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you very much.
Next, we have Kenneth Mantel. He's a partner at Olshan, the #1 ranked law firm for advising investors in activist campaigns. Ken has worked with numerous high-profile investors such as Elliott. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me.
Right. Maybe Rory, Patricia, and Ken, maybe we start with a brief bios about yourself, and then we can kick off the webinar. Rory, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks. So as Wahid said, Rory Wallace, I'm the founder of Outerbridge Capital Management, an investment firm based in New York that invests in technology and technology-impacted sectors. I've been investing in small cap companies and I guess mid-cap companies for about 15 years, about 13 of those as a portfolio manager. And in evolving my strategy and approach over time, activism became relevant as a means to effecting change in certain situations where we would see value in a situation at a company, but might perceive there to be some obstacle that needed to be course corrected. And so over the course of the last 5 or so years, have become much more focused on shareholder activism and have gotten to know the team at CMH and Agility and Olshan very well and can really attest to their capabilities. So definitely they have a lot more experience in this realm than I do, since for me it's been sort of 5 years and for them it's been a lifetime or a career. But yeah, with that, I'll turn it over.
Thanks, Rory. Patricia?
It has been a lifetime. I have been recruiting board directors for 26 years on sort of all sides of the equation. I've worked with issuers and investors, both activists, hedge funds, private equity firms, so all sort of forms of corporate governance, and have seen a lot from the trenches, very much focused on diversity in the boardroom. Wrote a book in 2021 called Time's Up, Why Boards Need to Get Diverse Now, and really excited to share some of the insights on working on activist board searches.
Thanks. Ken?
Hi, Ken from Olshan. So we regularly represent activist investors at really all stages of potential engagement and all types of different activist investors, ones who are very experienced in the area and have done campaigns, and those who are just considering looking into it for the first time and really learning as they go. And we try to guide clients from the initial assessment or understanding of the situation through getting them an understanding of their various legal options and constraints and formulating a comprehensive strategy that we can help them implement.
Great. Thank you. Welcome, everyone. So the results of the poll are in. Interestingly, 68% of the respondents have been part of an activist campaign, which is a relatively high number. 32% have not. 16% have been are part of an executive or public board company that was targeted. 11% have been part of an activist or executive team of an activist group. And then we have a number of advisors to activist investors. And interestingly, 30% have never been part of an activist campaign. So these I would consider to be a newer group of people. Now, the one other stat is, are you currently or have been in past served on board of a public company? Like 42% have said yes. So we do have a good tally of board members. So that's great. Thank you everyone for participating in that poll. Before we jump into the webinar, a few quick words about ZMH. We are a strategic advisor on activist campaigns. Our team includes senior professionals from ISS Special Situations research team that writes all the reports that you see, and Morgan Stanley Activism Defense team, in addition to professionals from proxy solicitation and IR. We leverage our experience from over 300 campaigns at firms such as Huntsman, LivePerson, US Foods, ADP, and P&G to develop a comprehensive blueprint that includes all aspects of a proxy campaign, including recruitment with Patricia, shareholder outreach, investor messaging, and most importantly, ISS and Glass Lewis engagement strategies. For many first-time activists, we are the glue that binds the entire campaign together. Our practice is powered by a proprietary platform that includes insights on global investors with over 75 trillion of AUM. Proud to know that Bloomberg ranked ZMH as the #2 global strategic advisor for activists. With that, let's return to the webinar. Today, we will cover a few high-level themes. Number one, how and why investors target companies and incumbent directors. Number two, what are the best practices for recruiting nominees in an activist campaign? And number three, what are the legal considerations of pursuing a proxy fight in identifying and nominating director nominees? As Taylor said at the beginning, please submit your questions through the chat window. We will try to cover them throughout the discussion and or try to answer them at the end. With that, Rory, let me start with you with the first question. What drives an investor to pursue an activist strategy?
I think what really drives investors to pursue an activist strategy, it comes down to that there's a sort of logic that making an investment in general, you want to have a divergent view versus the market on what the value of your company or investment is. And with activism, you have a divergent view versus what the company is currently doing. And it may be the company's strategy around capital allocation. It may be around how they present their financials, or it could be around who's running the company. And, whereas your view on intrinsic value on a normal investment may correct over time with the company executing as you expect, with activism, you really think there needs to be an exogenous pressure on the company to create some type of catalyst that will change the direction of the business. And this can be relatively small scale, or it can be large scale. It could be that you believe or there's suitors for a business and you think that the right thing to do for shareholders is to put the company up for sale. And it could be as small as resegmenting financials to highlight a segment that's growing rapidly to the street so that investors can perceive that potential value upside. So you can pursue activism, as everyone knows, more passively or constructively in the background via suggestion, persuasion, building relationships with the company, or more aggressively with public letters or a proxy contest. But a lot of the approach that I think we use is really based on a judgment around management and board alignment, competency, and willingness to engage with shareholders to hear their views and perspectives. I think a lot of companies, unfortunately, are quite close-minded about that, or dismissive about that. And that may be changing now as activism has sort of gone through a public rebranding, some of the things that have happened with the Engine #1 campaign. I think people no longer just have the view of activists as being a Carl Icahn sort of cliche from the movie Wall Street, where they're just trying to liquidate companies for asset value. I think it's much more nuanced than that, and people generally recognize that now. But it's really just about changing the status quo to create value for the shareholders, and in most cases, that's going to create value for all the stakeholders at the company.
Thank you. So related to that, once you see a company not engaging with you in a constructive manner, how do you go from that point to identify like the directors who need to be replaced, or how do you start the director search process?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's difficult being completely external to the boardroom to really make that assessment about who may or may not be contributing. And honestly, looking simply at a resume, well, you may not be able to really deduce much, because someone could have a great resume, but they're not really showing up to meetings, and there's no way you would know that as an average shareholder. But really what you're trying to deduce is this board functioning as a true governance body on behalf of the shareholders in a functional way and in a diligent way? There are some red flags you can identify. I think, long tenure, for example, is always a red flag. If you have many directors serving for 10 to 20 years, even shorter than that, really, but 10 to 20 would be a clear sign that there just hasn't been much rotation, and thus there's probably not fresh perspectives being brought to bear. There's probably people whose experience, if it was relevant 20 years ago, may no longer be relevant in these fast-changing industries. And then I think interconnectedness is another potential red flag. If you have people that have worked together in other contexts, that can certainly be great for management to know each other. But when it comes to the board, I think you really do want people that are quite independent from one another when it comes to making those big governance decisions. Obviously, if board members have a history with problematic transactions, really poor results in some other situations, those would be things you'd want to be aware of and potentially target those individuals. And I think, trying to engage with the board and then, seeing how they respond and whether they do evince sort of capability and professionalism or they don't, is another good way to sort of make these identifications of individuals that might need to come off the board. And when it comes to running a search, I think as an investor, you're typically very time constrained, working on many different things. And so, it's really important, in my opinion, to run a comprehensive process around this, so that you don't gravitate just towards the first person that crosses your screen or someone that you already know. You want to run this process in a way that is very different from how companies often run their searches, which is more ad hoc or relationship based. And you want to be as thoughtful as possible about it. And not just because you want to present that publicly if you do run a campaign and defend the process you ran, but also because you'll learn a lot through interacting with many different individuals. You'll learn a lot about the company, even because people just, industry experts that have done this for 30 years, they may look at the company you're invested in and really have some interesting insights. So I think to that end, I highly recommend using the advisors on this call. I think ZMH actually made the introduction to agility, and Patricia does a great job of providing a list of vetted candidates that are willing to sign up for a dissident slate, which is always more difficult than just being put on a board constructively. And so you can start from a position of strength with many different bios of people to begin your interviews, and then ultimately run the campaign from the strongest position possible.
Thanks, Rory. Very helpful. So Patricia, let's say Rory is looking at a situation. He identifies gaps on the board and he calls you and say, hey, Patricia, we need to find or recruit new nominees. What are the best practices in your opinion? How do you help like investors find the right candidate?
Oh, sorry. I think, I'll go through a couple of sort of best practices, but before I'll just state that in general, it's always the best person for the role and not necessarily somebody I know. So that should be true in all cases of recruiting, but I like to emphasize that it's not, I don't just open a Rolodex and say, okay, you know, I'm going to put, you know, so-and-so on the board because I know them and it's easy. It's always who's the best person for the job and how do we get them to listen and pay attention. So I think it always starts with a conversation with the activists. What are they thinking about? What is their thesis? Where do they see opportunities for change? What are their observations, et cetera, et cetera. So we go through kind of that kind of conversation. And then I do my own analysis of the board. So I do a deep dive into, you know, many of the things that Rory talked about. What does the board currently look like in terms of tenure, expertise? The other thing, I'm not an ageist, but, you know, there are, I actually pulled up while Rory was talking, there are 286 directors over 85 years old on public companies in the United States. So we love those people, but we need to think about the future because 85 is 85. So look at, you know, take a deep dive into the strengths, the gaps, you know, looking at the strategy of the business. Where are they heading? What does the board look like today? And where, unfortunately, are the gaps? How does that align to the, you know, activist ideas? Put it all together. And basically, I always build a matrix because I like to build my own matrix and not look at the proxy and their matrix, because there's a whole bunch of, I like to do my own due diligence, let's put it that way. And look at the weakest directors and where there's opportunity to improve. And then once I understand all of this, I go out into the market and I look for the very best people who can potentially serve on the slate. So each, you know, list is built from scratch. I go out, I talk to a lot of directors and try to understand their availability, their personality, their interest in transformation. It's not, you know, this is the opposite of ceremonial board appointment. This is a board appointment where you roll up your sleeves and you're going to be doing some heavy lifting and some transformational work. So you really want to make sure that your director candidates, not only do they have the sort of expertise on paper, but they have the style and personality, wherewithal, and availability to actually do a fabulous job. You're on mute, Wahid.
Sorry. So related question on that is we often hear, one question we often hear from investors is it easy to recruit a nominee for a first-time activist or a newer investor versus a more established player? What has been your experience?
So I've recruited for the more established as well as the newer players. And it's like anything, you know, brand and positive reputation always help. However, it's my job to tell the compelling story to the right people and make them understand why this is an amazing opportunity. So that's why, you know, I get hired so that I can go out and work on behalf of my reputation in the market as a recruiter who does, you know, excellent board searches. So I can go out on behalf of a newer activist and make a case because people know me from the sort of world of board recruiting. So I can talk about, you know, why this activist is worth listening to, why the situation is a good one. And if I do my job right, then, you know, obviously I bring great people. And, you know, candidates will ask about the track record of the activist if they don't have kind of the big brand, their reputation. You know, candidates these days are very risk averse in general for all board searches. So they do a lot of due diligence, you know, on the company, on the activists, on the other board members. That's very, very important. Who will they be in the room with? So they're going to ask a lot of questions, but that's true for, you know, all board searches.
Thank you. And sort of one additional question on that topic, working with the investors, especially newer ones, what are the most common mistakes? Like you mentioned, finding people who they know previously, but other than that, what else do you see? What are the major pitfalls to avoid?
I mean, I think, you know, finding candidate, and look, obviously I have a vested interest for, you know, using a recruiter, but the truth of the matter is I always tell people, companies, activists, whoever, I use a sports analogy. I say, pick your sport, and let's say football, although I know nothing about it, but, you know, obviously with the Super Bowl. So when a football team needs a new defenseman. I don't even know if that's a type of player, but if they need a new quarterback, do they sit around the locker room and say, okay, who do we know? Who's going to, who can we ask to go onto our team to be the new quarterback? Or do they hire a scout and who goes across the country, across the world, and finds the very best quarterback or defenseman to sort of join the team, and together, the sum is greater than the parts. So I use the same thing with recruiting, whether it's talking to companies or activists, putting your brother, or your cousin or your neighbor, they may be amazing, but they may not be the right person for the job. So I think looking at the low-hanging fruit, and by the way, when you come in and complain about bad governance and then you put on your cousin who may not be qualified, it's not necessarily doing anything differently than what you're complaining about in the company. So I think, taking the easy path is a problem. I think looking at candidates who don't have board experience is an example. I think one of the things I've learned I've been working with activists since 2015 is that, public company board experience is really important. If you're nominating a slate with, several candidates, it's possible to have one or two that don't have public company board experience, but this is not a training wheel exercise. It's a jump in and get to work. So I think, putting candidates up who don't have public company board experience can be an issue. So I'll stop there for now.
All right, great. Thank you. So Ken, in terms of when you are advising investor clients, what are the key legal considerations that investors should understand in recruiting nominees?
So we try to work with our clients from the very beginning to give them a full understanding of the situation. And at the very start of this process is the ability to nominate candidates, to get the right candidates, of course, to assess the need and what the investment thesis is and who can really contribute to that, but also to be able to have a valid nomination that the company will be able to accept as opposed to fight. And that's just a key part of the process, and that involves being able to follow certain procedural steps and deadlines that the company sets out. So it's very important for really from the beginning of any kind of investigation of a company for an investor to understand what those processes are, what the time frame would be, so they can make sure that they're taking steps and able to meet that time frame, because there will be a nomination deadline. If a nomination is not formally submitted in the proper manner by that time frame, then the company will have a very good ability to be able to say that they need to come back next year. So something to bear in mind is the timing and the ability to get candidates to provide the necessary information to make that formal nomination, and to do so in a timely manner. So there are some other pitfalls that you have to think about when you're identifying candidates. Of course, you are looking for people who are going to be able to fill the needs on the board, who are going to be able to add value. But as you're looking into them, certainly would perform some background checks, certainly would look into their experience and make sure you have that understanding of who these people are. You should certainly speak to them, get that sense of how they will be in the boardroom, because there will be pressures placed on them once they are actually in the boardroom, regardless of their qualifications. And you want to make sure that they stand up and they're going to be able to use their experience to benefit the company. That said, there are also some pitfalls to watch out for, as far as potentially being some negative or more difficult information, to make sure if there is something about a candidate that you have awareness of that. And also there are certain things, conflicts of interest or potential service on a competitive board that could be difficult or potentially disqualifying for a candidate, even if they do have the right sort of experience. So it's important to identify those things, because once the nomination is in and the deadline has passed, you only have the candidates who you've submitted, and you can withdraw, but you generally will not be able to substitute. So it's critical that you get the right people identified, you get them signed up, you get the information from them, and it's in a timely manner. And then you're able to move forward if you need to go to the meeting.
Very helpful. So, Ken, a related question we often hear is, what kind of agreements do investors enter into potential nominees in terms of like paying them for the time and expertise, indemnifications? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So different investors will do things differently
Mm-hmm.
here. There's no requirement that candidates be paid. There's no requirement that candidates be indemnified. As far as making sure that you're satisfying requirements and that things are moving in an orderly way, generally you'll have some kind of coordination, whether in a formal legal document or not, with the candidates on what exactly is going to happen with respect to any required legal filings, such as proxy statements and so on, or maybe Schedule 13D filings and amendments. So you have that baseline coordination, which may or may not require an agreement. As far as compensating candidates, different investors have different thoughts on it. Certainly, there is a lot of effort and a lot of time that goes into serving as a candidate in an activist campaign, providing the information, meeting with investors, meeting with proxy advisors. So we certainly think it's reasonable for there to be some compensation, and perhaps to attract certain types of candidates that's necessary, but it is to taste and based on need. As far as indemnification, there is a potential concern that there could be a lawsuit involved. It is an adversarial process, and it provides some comfort to candidates to understand that they're being indemnified by the investor in a contest. Now, all that said, if there is going to be a lawsuit, the investor would be the primary mover. They're probably the deeper pocket. So we don't really see candidates as having a significant legal risk, but it is something that a lot of investors will provide indemnification to give candidates that level of comfort.
Great, thank you. Like one question that relates to activist nominee, and Ken, I want to start, and then Rory, I want you to pitch in as well, is this issue about in allowing the activist nominee to interview with the management team as part of this process. We hear like conflicting opinions, like if we do let them interview, they'll reject, and then we have to overcome this narrative that our candidate was not the right candidate, or the process that the board and management run is not a good faith process. So can you comment on like how do you advise your clients deal with this question, and Rory, the investor perspective on it will be helpful.
Yeah, so this is definitely something that comes up. So there are actually advance notice bylaws, which are the procedural requirements that are necessary for a shareholder to nominate. More and more companies are putting in requirements that candidates make themselves available to interview. So that gives the company a hammer. If they are asking for an interview, they at least say that they may invalidate the nomination if the interview is not provided. I'd say that that's a very heavy-handed approach for companies, but it is an approach that some companies will take. So you understand whether that is something that needs to be considered. As far as a request for an interview otherwise, it's understood that there's information gathering that's taking place, but this is very much an adversarial process, and would certainly expect that the company is searching for information, and it may be used in any manner. Any information that is provided about the candidate, whether in an interview or otherwise, could be used in the campaign, and there's an understanding of that. So it certainly should be cautious in providing an interview. An interview is appropriate in some circumstances. I wouldn't say in absolutely every circumstance. It is very much based on the particular situation, discussions between the parties. If there are good faith discussions about a potential resolution, then candidates who may be put on the board in part of that resolution ultimately would need to interview and provide some information, and that's reasonable and recognized. But you want to understand whether you are having those good faith discussions or whether this request for an interview is really being made when everyone has their guns drawn, and it is very much more of an adversarial type context. So, we try to advise our clients based on the particular facts.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm very sympathetic to the time commitment that candidates make when they sign up for a director slate. And this is something that introduces an additional time commitment for them. With that said, I think that while there's certainly that need to understand the risks of the adversarial process, and that anything you say, can and will be used against you and probably misportrayed by the company if there isn't a resolution reached, it is a two-sided conversation. And actually, I think you can learn some valuable things about the board members across the table from you, and who you might be able to work with and who you might not be able to work with. And I think viewing it as information gathering for the activist as well as for the company, then it just comes down to who's going to be better prepared, and who's able to kind of have those discussions productively, and maybe I guess get the upper hand if it does break that way. But I think despite the risks, I think there is upside to following through on it. And obviously, if you don't make your candidates available for interviews, then that will be used against you for sure. So I think it's somewhat nuanced, but with the right candidates, I think you can kind of trust them to go in there and learn what they can learn, and also not make any sort of foot faults.
Great. Thank you. So we've received a number of questions in the chat. Patricia, let me start with you. The first question is, do you feel the perception has changed from the past in becoming part of an activist slate? Does it make it difficult for you to join a traditional company board once you're part of an activist slate?
Well, I think that it's changed enormously since I've been doing this work. As I said, since 2015, I used to call director candidates and they would hang up on me and say, you would never do this kind of work. It's completely changed. So since then, I think I just read a statistic that 38% of directors in the Russell 3000 have experience with activism. So as people have more experience, they understand it's not the devil incarnate that it used to be thought of. It's really a legitimate, serious asset class that improves companies for the most part. So I think directors used to be concerned. I think they are, depending on the situation, depending on the activist reputation, sometimes they are worried. But I would say for the most part, like more than 95% of the time, people realize that it's an opportunity to be part of a transformation process, a good board potentially, and a good situation. So people are open to listen for the most part and learn more.
Great, thank you. The next question is also director related. Are there characteristics apart from a specific sector or board experience that make for a good candidate for an activist campaign?
Does anybody, I mean, I can take that, or if somebody else wants to answer, I can give from my point of view.
Why don't we start with you, Patricia, and Rory, and can feel free to jump in.
So, I grew up in the dark ages of corporate governance, the late 90s, early 2000s, when basically, needed to be a CEO with a heartbeat. So I think today it's, quite different. I think an activist years ago said to me that we were talking about the qualifications and personality, and he said to me, does he think like an owner? And I thought, oh my God, like I've done hundreds of board searches and nobody really asked me that question. Like people don't really talk about it in that, from that frame of mind. So I think that was a very interesting thing. Are they going to really take the job seriously and do the best for all shareholders, not just the activists, but and think like they're part of the organization rather than they're there in a ceremonial capacity and they're sitting on, 5 other boards and this is just, a nice way to spend some time. So I think really taking the job seriously, in addition to having, all of the other qualifications, the hard qualifications on paper, but really not being overboarded, willing to do the hard work, willing to ask the tough questions without, alienating people, are kind of style characteristics that make for a good director, for all directors, but particularly, when an activist is looking for someone.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple of more questions in the chat, but there are three things I did want to cover on the webinar before we address those questions. Rory, this is for you. You have settled with company for outside independent director, and then you've served on the board of the same company. What is your experience in like when you were engaging with the company from the outside versus being on the inside as a director?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, I think your informational advantage from being on the board yourself and being directly involved in these situations is a significant one. And so I think, it's not to be underestimated that specifically in a really complex situation, you may end up determining as the investor that you really should be one of the directors that's on the board to be able to carry out the strategic changes that you think are necessary. But I think there are certain situations where having that independent with that highly relevant industry background or tremendous leadership experience can be really a great fulcrum for driving that change. I think sometimes that sort of forging ground of a proxy contest, you really people get the candidates that I've worked with have gotten very invested in this outcome, done tons of research on the situation, and been completely ready to hit the ground running and just go in to carry out their plan and change what they thought needed to be changed in a way that I think would have exceeded my own capabilities to do that. We had one candidate who was a naval aviator and then became an admiral, just very, very strong leader and able to take on a significant challenge of the boardroom that she went into and get that respect and drive results. So I think it's very situational, but it is important to understand that, and this kind of goes to communication expectations, the situation when your candidates go on, if they are independent, it will evolve. And the specific sets of experience that you were looking for when you put those people on may no longer be the most applicable in a future situation. And you may not know when those moments of change occur because you'll be blinded from some of that information. And so I think if you really understand a company well as an investor and you think you can be value additive on the board, I think it's right to think long and hard about whether you actually should be the person stepping onto that board to drive the change in the value maximization that you think can be done.
Very helpful. And I think that goes to a question we often hear from our investor clients, and that is the rights and obligation of their nominee after joining the board as it pertains to communicating with them after they become a director. So Ken, what do you see are the challenges? Like what do you tell the activist nominee before they join the board? This is how you can communicate after you become a director.
So I guess to start, this also fits into what you're looking for in a director candidate, because someone who's joining the board in this kind of context, they often have to establish their own credibility and they have to establish their really the willingness of the other directors to collaborate with them, especially if you're talking about one or two directors joining an established board, perhaps as the result of the end of a contest, question of what kind of interaction, communication there's been with the board beforehand. So you need people who are going to be able to try to convince and build consensus and work collaboratively. So not just experience, but also personality and, well, experience in collaborating and building consensus. That does matter. So as far as the rights of directors, once a director joins the board, whether it's in a settlement or whether it's following an election, they should be treated like all of the other directors. And each of the directors has confidentiality obligations to the company, isn't freely able to share confidential information with anyone who does not have an NDA with the company. And they generally have to abide by company policies, and ultimately they have to abide by their duties to shareholders, their legal duties. So a director would not be able to freely communicate after they're on the board with an activist investor. So there are situations where there could be a confidentiality agreement that's signed that enables some amount of communication with that director, with the remainder of the board, with the investor. Or it really could be based on information that is not confidential. So, what I would advise a candidate is to understand what their obligations are, to very much look at the company's policies, and they certainly will have to abide by them. But they should not be a wallflower, and they may very well need to be may need to challenge what the company and its legal advisors are telling them that the director's role may be. But to some extent, the company's rules with respect to other directors will apply to them. And if they are being applied evenly, then each director will have to abide by them.
Great, thank you. Let's take a few questions from the Q&A chat. The first question is, what is your perspective on directors being compensated by the sponsor versus normal board fees? Patricia, do you want to comment on that?
I could, but I want to defer to Ken and Rory, since I think you have much more experience with that, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So compensation, as I was discussing it earlier, is really for the campaign, for providing information and for participating in meetings and generally doing the things that would be done before joining the board. It is not typical for there to be compensation by an investor or any outside party for a director's work on the board. So I just want to make that distinction. Certainly reasonable and I believe accepted for there to be compensation for work through the campaign, but work while on the board is a different matter. Generally, we wouldn't see any kind of outside compensation at that time.
Yeah, thanks. I think if Rory and Patricia, if you don't have any additional comments, I'll move on to the next question.
I was just going to add one thing. Once you're on the board, you have to be an independent director, so the compensation has to stop. Ken's point.
Great. The next question is, activist investors get a bad rep for diversity, particularly gender diversity. Why is that? And I think all three of you can provide some color on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably somewhat reflective of the fact that, unfortunately, the buy side, especially with hedge funds, has historically not been very gender diverse. But I think there are signs that that's changing, which is very positive. And I think, and that's even an issue at the C-suite ranks, right? There's just fewer women candidates out there. With that said, when we ran a proxy contest in this situation, the Navy admiral I was referring to was a woman, and she was the one of our slate that ended up going on the board. And I think she actually made it a mission to progress diversity within the company down through the ranks, not just at the board level. So I think activists can be a positive force for diversity. I think that board that when we first came in, it was all, quite elderly white males, and the composition has changed considerably since then. So I don't think that bad rep is warranted, although I'm sure there's a lot of bias in the way that people approach decisions in this industry, just like in all industries.
And I'll add to that, I think, many activists, maybe most, I'm not sure, don't use a recruiter and do, as we talked about earlier, go to their own network and don't take a very strategic point of view when it comes to board recruiting. It's like, okay, this person's, I know them, they're kind of good enough. So you end up with a lack of diversity. When they do use a recruiter, I know at least in my case, there's always a lot of diversity. And actually the activists that engage with me talk about the importance of showing and bringing diverse candidates to the table. So I think by definition, if they're going out and working with a recruiter, they are paying attention to the best practices of good governance, which includes diversity.
And we can, like from our vantage point, we've seen, because we help a lot of clients and companies engage with the stewardship teams of like some of the largest investors out there. In a proxy contest, is when you have an activist nominee going up against an incumbent, a minority incumbent, right, who recently joined the board, it becomes a challenging conversation with the stewardship teams, because here you're trying to replace someone who represents minority is a minority candidate, recently joined the board with relevant skill set, and you're trying to replace them with someone who does not represent diversity. That conversation is an awkward conversation to have, especially when you have like large institutions asking you, why do you want to replace the only sort of diverse candidate who recently joined the board? And if the activist hasn't thought through in terms of why his or her candidate is the best fit for this campaign, it becomes a very awkward conversation. So I think like when you think like from an investor point of view, understanding how the traditional stewardship teams would react to this diversity is a key component of what we advise our clients think about.
Yeah, and I would add to that it's important within that whether that situation would arise through the company's own machinations, right? Because a company, if they have a classified board, they might try to construct a situation cynically in such a fashion to make that an issue when it really is an issue about creating value, right? And so I think that's something that I know you guys are at ZMH are prepared to help strategize and engage around.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Just switching gears a little bit, I wanted to touch upon like one high level stuff that we do see in the market, and that is the emergence of white knight investors in support of management team in a contested situation. We seeing this play out at a large public company right now, where I think we have two activist investors and like a third investor who is siding with the management publicly. How does that impact the dynamics of a proxy contest in your opinion? Like I would love like Ken, your and Rory, your like insight on it.
Well, it certainly complicates matters, but not unusual for there to be multiple investors who believe that there's value in a company that is not being realized, and they may have similar ideas or they may have different ideas. And in those cases where you have different ideas, you have competing agendas. And it's certainly something to bear in mind, because there may be a view by some investors that there is improvement from attention to shareholders and shareholder representation, and perhaps they may see it as a one or the other, as if one investor comes in and they're going to pressure and try to freshen things up, that would do the job. So I would say that sometimes that may be the case if they have similar views on untapped value, and sometimes it may not be, because they're very much seeing different things that need to happen at the company. So it is a very interesting dynamic that makes for some interesting kinds of situations, and it's very much case by case, but would certainly hope that other investors and proxy advisors are really looking into what each of these different activist investors is looking to accomplish, and whether what they are looking to accomplish is going to add value, or whether they are just putting their name out there.
Yeah, I think it to some extent all of this is subjective when you're arguing about what is best, what's the best strategy for the company to follow. There can be numerous people that have different assessments of that, and ultimately, I guess shareholders can determine, the other shareholders of the company can determine which arguments are most persuasive and can support the candidates that they think have the winning arguments. I think just like a third party candidate in an election, it could cause the company to have an advantage if there's dissent within the ranks of the shareholders about what path to follow. I think what's problematic about the white knight approach is when a company just doesn't want to lose to an activist and change over control the board, and then they run out and they do something that's value destructive because they're running into the hands of the white knight, and that would be a situation where you're creating a new security. It might be a voting security preferred, and you're basically, the company is doing this to prevent change that the activist wants and that the other shareholders of the company might want, and they're doing something that's somewhat poisonous to the rest of the common shareholders. I think in general, the white knight dynamic is not a problem, and in some sense, it's maybe good to hear more voices, talking about a situation in public.
Can I add one comment about the white knight situation that you're talking about? In this high profile situation, whose company name shall remain unnamed, is it possible that the white knight is coming in because one of the activist nominees are just weak? So they're just not great. It's not a great slate of nominees. So therefore the other activist is coming in to support the company because they see that there's some problematic directors being put up on the other activist slate. Just a thought, but in this particular case, I think, it's true. One of the activists does not have a great slate of candidates, unfortunately. Not sure if anyone else on the panel has an idea about that, but that's, just what I was thinking when I saw this whole situation play out.
Right. So we're obviously not involved with the situation, so we can provide our 2 cents
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
what we think. I feel like, having gone through all the publicly available material, I would concur like that one of the slate is stronger than the other slate. But a lot of times, especially in this situation, the shareholder base makes a huge difference, right? So sometimes if like maybe 20, 30, 35% of the shares are held by retail shareholders, they don't have the same like evaluation process as an institutional investor does in evaluating the slates, right? And at that time, and in those situations, it's the narrative that oftentimes wins the battle, right? And having worked in solicitation and IR and like on all these campaigns, we know that retail investors to a large degree tend to be supportive of the incumbents, the management, because it's a very high hurdle for them to vote differently. And in a lot of these cases, these are former employees, they have vested interest in the company. So I think, yes, nominee do make a difference, but the quality of nominee has a much bigger impact when the shares are concentrated among few institutional investors who have a very robust process to evaluate the candidates. Right. So I think we have like 7 minutes left. So maybe we can towards the end, if you guys can talk about share 2 to 3 key takeaways from your experience working on some campaigns in terms of identifying recruiting directors and best practices and what leads to a better outcome. Rory, let's start with you.
Sure. Well, I would say it's when you sign up for an activist campaign and you cross that threshold from just being passive in the background, or suggestivism, which is a term some people use, to really being vocal. I think it's going to be a long and arduous path, and it's going to take up a lot of your time. You're going to have a lot of stress around this situation, and I think the number one way to prepare yourself to operate successfully under all that stress, and you'll be running your business alongside this, of course, is to really work with great advisors. And I think everyone on this call, Ocean, ZMH, and Agility, are really at the top of their field, in my opinion, and have really helped us in some very difficult situations to get good outcomes. So that's first and foremost. I think with that said, while it's very difficult, activism, and it can be draining, I also think it's extremely rewarding and necessary. I think these can be moments that save a company potentially, from entering into extreme distress or from doing something that would permanently impair shareholder value. And so, what you're doing has the ability to impact not just all the shareholders and create wealth, hopefully, if the company responds to your engagement, but also to really impact the downstream constituencies of the employees at the company, the customers of the company. And without shareholder activism, I think you would have a lot more stagnation and just underperformance at a lot of these companies, which would be to the detriment of all stakeholders. So I think it's extremely important, and it can be very rewarding.
Thanks. Patricia?
So I think, it's important to remember that not all activists are created equal. So there are, different, levels of quality, of size, of interest. So I think it's important just to remember you can't put them all in one bucket. It's not just a monolith. And I think from a company point of view, I think no one has a monopoly on good ideas. So I think listening to the activists, and when they approach and they invest in a company, they've done a lot of homework, they've done a lot of due diligence. I think listening to their ideas, they may not all be right, but some of them will be right. And it's important, as a board, as management, to listen to, shareholders, particularly ones that are coming forward and saying, okay, I have an opinion. Here's how I think, we can improve this business. And it's important to listen.
Thanks. Ken? I think you're on mute, Ken.
Sorry about that. So in situations where you're approaching the company as a potential investor, or there's time, certainly would say to front load any kind of analysis and consideration as far as who might be a good candidate and what the board might need. So there's ample time to have conversations, to do research, to be able to really get yourself a solid set of candidates. Sometimes you really don't have that opportunity. And for those who don't really have the opportunity, I would say that this engagement really ends up being a process. And at each stage of the process, you figure out what's going on and you try to determine what the next best step forward is to be able to achieve goals, to add value for shareholders. So would just be able to make decisions at each of those stages as far as what the next best step is and who candidates and advisors and otherwise are able to assist.
Thank you. Thanks. I think let me check the Q&A. We don't have any additional question. We're almost up on time. Well, thank you all three of you for making time today for this webinar and sharing your insights. And hopefully the attendees found this informative. A recording of this webinar will be on ZMH website. Once again, thank you for the attendees for attending, and happy Valentine's Day for all. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.